Hello guys. Tonight's story isn't about empires or epic discoveries. It's about something messier, closer, and much, much colder. It's about the clang of metal in a wooden bowl, the hiss of an iron dipped into flame, the way blood dries black under fingernails, and how silence falls heavy after a scream. Tonight, you're not a noble. You're not even educated. But in this town, when someone is gasping, bleeding, begging, they don't call for a physician. They call for you. So before we begin, take a breath. Let the room dim. Maybe light a candle, or imagine the flicker of one nearby. Because tonight, we're stepping into a place where science hadn't yet arrived. And still, lives depended on hands steady enough to shave a cheek, and bold enough to saw through bone. You're the barber, you're the surgeon, and you wouldn't last a single day. Imagine it's just before dawn. The town is quiet, the sky still blue-black, and frost clings to the cobblestones outside your shop. Your fingers ache from yesterday, but there's no time for that. The fire must be stoked, the water boiled, and your blades, they need sharpening. Not one or two blades, all of them. The small, curved hook for tooth pulling. The long blade for splitting abscesses. Scissors, razors, saws. The whetstone scrapes in rhythm again and again. There's a comfort in the sound, because everything else today will scream. The shop itself isn't much. A single room with wooden floors soaked from years of spills. A bench against one wall, and a broad stool in the center. No chairs for waiting. People stand, or they don't come at all. The smell hits you as the fire warms the space. A mix of stale sweat, damp wool, blood. Not fresh, but metallic and tired. Under it all, cheap gin. You keep a bottle handy. Not for yourself, at least not yet, but for the ones who beg for courage before the cutting starts. Your first customer isn't really a customer. He's just a man with a face full of stubble and one eye swollen shut from a bar fight. He wants a shave, and maybe if you have time, he says, you could take a look at the gash on his thigh. He doesn't have much coin, but he'll trade you fish, caught fresh this morning. You nod. You're already boiling water for the razor, because here there are no appointments, no records, only what's urgent and what can wait. And even then, not everything that can wait should. He-Man takes his seat, the stool in the center, and tilts his chin without a word. You pour steaming water into a cracked ceramic bowl and soak a cloth. It's clean. Enough. Or at least cleaner than the rag wrapped around his thigh. The shave goes smoothly. A rare mercy. The trick is a sharp blade and steady hand. But more than that, it's knowing where to slow down, where the skin pulls tight across the jaw or dips just below the cheekbone. Small talk, that's for tailors. You focus on the job, and then it's time for the thigh. You ask him to lie down, and when you peel back the cloth, the wound is angry and red. Not deep, but dirty, the kind of gash that can rot if left alone. He winces as you prod it gently, and you see it. Grit, tiny stones, even a splinter. He says he cleaned it. You know he didn't. You pour the boiling water over the wound. He bites down on his sleeve, muffling a cry. Then comes the scraping, with a blunt-edged spoon. You dig out the dirt. There's no anesthesia, only the rough leather strap you hand him, and whatever strength he has left not to scream. You rinse your fingers in the same bowl you shaved him with. That's the way of it. You clean when you can, but resources are thin, and time is thinner. Instruments are reused. Water is reheated. Sterility is a dream from the future. When the wound is finally clear, you thread your needle. It's thick, the kind used for canvas, not skin. And the thread, made from animal gut soaked in vinegar. You stitch fast, because slow means suffering. When it's done, you wrap the leg in a linen bandage. And for now, that's all you can do. You hand him the rest of the gin and wish him good luck. He thanks you, barely. Then he limps out. His blood is on your hands, under your nails and soaking the wood. And you haven't even had breakfast. But the line outside your door is growing. There's a boy with a swollen jaw. Toothache, likely. A woman who can't bend her fingers anymore. A farmer's wife with something wrapped in a shawl, holding it close. Maybe a sick child. Or a tumor. They don't come because you're the best. They come because you're the only one who dares to do what needs doing. The day stretches long, like the shadow of a gallows in the afternoon light. You deal with the boy first. His mother's knuckles are white from holding him still. His cheek bulges unnaturally. The tooth is far gone. Black at the root, maybe infected to the bone. There's no question. It has to come out. You offer the boy a strap of leather, thick and worn from hundreds of clenched jaws before his. Then you heat the iron tongs in the fire, not red hot, but warm enough to soften what little infection it touches. There's no finesse here, just force and angle. One hard pull. He shrieks. You press a cloth to his mouth as the socket weeps blood, and his mother murmurs something low and quick, like a prayer. It's over in seconds, but those seconds stretch long in memory. You drop the tooth into a small jar, one of many. You don't keep them for trophies. Some you sell, crushed into powder, as a remedy for various imagined ailments. Others, you don't know why you keep them. Habit maybe. A reminder that this work leaves nothing untouched, not even you. Between procedures, you wipe your hands in a basin of grey water. The soap you have is homemade, lye-heavy and sharp-smelling. It bites your skin, but not hard enough to kill what lingers under your fingernails. There's a rhythm to this life. Cut, clean, bandage, breathe. Sometimes the blood dries on your apron before you remember to change it. Sometimes you forget your own hunger until your hands shake, but you keep going. The next patient brings something different. A burn across the chest, blistered and oozing. A kitchen accident. You don't ask for details. You just smear a thick paste of goose fat and crushed herbs across the wound and bandage it gently. You know it won't heal well. It may not heal at all, but it's better than nothing. And always, always there's the smell. It clings to your sleeves, your beard, your bedding. Not just blood, but rot. Old wounds, infection. The scent of living people slowly falling apart. You learn to breathe shallowly, to eat with your hands scrubbed raw, to sleep while dreaming of teeth cracking, bones splintering, and threads pulling tight through flesh. This is your life. You didn't choose it, but someone had to do it. Afternoon gives way to dusk, and the air grows colder. Your hands are numb now, not from cold, but from repetition. Muscle memory guides you more than thought. You could stitch a wound in the dark. You often do. As the final patient of the day stumbles in, a soldier with a broken forearm and a face full of road dust, you see the day's final challenge laid bare. His arm is crooked, swollen. The bone has buckled beneath the skin. He says little, just grits his teeth and nods. You know the drill. You brace him against the bench. One assistant holds his shoulders. Another grips his thighs. You kneel, grip the forearm, and pull. Hard. The snap echoes through the room. Not of bone breaking, but realigning. He screams, a guttural sound that fades into a slow, gasping silence. You splint the limb with rough-cut wood and linen strips. You'll need to check it again tomorrow, or the day after. If the swelling doesn't go down, well, there are saws for that. With the last patient gone, the shop finally quiets. The fire burns low. The floor is slick with sloshed water and footprints in blood. You wipe the blades one by one. Some you dip in boiling water. Others, you simply wipe with a cloth and hang back on the wall. You've stopped believing in cleanliness. You aim for cleaning up. Sometimes you whisper apologies to the tools themselves. They've seen too much, done too much. You eat cold bread with trembling fingers. Your beard is stiff with dried fluid. You don't know whose. And as you sit alone in the flickering firelight, you remember what the townsfolk call you. Surgeon, healer, charlatan, butcher. All of them true, all of them earned. And tomorrow, when the cock crows, they'll line up again. Because you don't promise miracles, only that you'll try, that you'll cut when others won't. And that, maybe, it'll be enough. The year is 1370. England is deep in the chaos of the 100 Years' War, a drawn-out conflict of shifting fronts and endless wounds. And amid the clash of steel and the cries of dying men, one figure begins to stand apart. Not a knight, not a king, but a man with ink-stained fingers and a scalpel sharpened more by necessity than training. John of Ardern, not born into fame, not trained in the halls of any prestigious medical school, because in truth, there weren't any that would teach someone like him. He was a barber surgeon, a tradesman with sharp tools and a sharper eye, and yet he would become one of the most respected and feared surgical minds in medieval England. We know little of his early life. Perhaps he apprenticed in Nottingham, where records place him later. Perhaps he began, like many barber surgeons, shaving beards and pulling teeth in damp corners of market squares. But what we do know is this: John had ambition, and more than that, he had an obsession, with precision, with documentation, and with wounds that others refused to touch. Most notably, the anal fistula, a condition painful, humiliating, and incredibly common among the noble class, particularly knights who spent days in the saddle. It was a wound of endurance, of pressure, and it festered in silence, destroying men not with swords, but with infection and shame. Physicians had no answers. Monks could only pray. But John dared to cut. He studied cadavers, rare and risky at the time. He observed the patterns of infection, the shape of the abscesses, and the nature of the pain. And slowly, through trial and error, he built something that had barely existed in England, a consistent surgical method. His technique involved incising the fistula, draining the infection, and threading a linen cord through the tract, a seton, which he would then tie and gradually tighten over days or weeks, allowing the wound to close slowly from the inside out. It wasn't painless. It wasn't always successful, but it worked more often than anything else available. And for those knights, proud, injured, humiliated, it was salvation. John's reputation grew not from title, but from results. And soon, patients travelled across counties, even across seas, just for a chance at his knife. He began to document everything: procedures, case studies, drawings, and notes. Not in Latin, like the physicians, but in a mix of English and French, and not always dry. His writing dripped with sarcasm and wit. He mocked the learned men who had never lifted a scalpel. and he scoffed at those who clung to astrology instead of anatomy. He was building something new, a craft rooted in the body, not in the stars. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit chamber in a crumbling castle. A nobleman lies on a straw-stuffed mattress, pale with fever, gripping the sheets. His attendants whisper in corners, unsure whether to call a priest or wait. Into this room walks John of Ardern, not a man dressed in robes of healing, but rather in fine cloth of his own choosing. A deliberate display of status. His beard is neatly trimmed. His belt holds not a rosary or a book of medicine, but a sheathed scalpel. He does not bow. He does not tremble. Because John knew that confidence was part of the cure. He would begin not with immediate cutting, but with careful examination. He would question the patient directly, ignoring the courtiers, demanding details others dared not discuss. Pain, duration, bleeding, bowel movements. In a world where modesty often meant death, John asked what no one else would. Then he would begin. He carried with him a toolkit of surgical instruments, long probes, curved knives, and narrow scissors, all housed in a portable wooden box lined with linen. These weren't made in a workshop. Some he designed himself. The fistula procedure, his most famous, began with what was known as a fistula knife, narrow and hooked. He would lance the tract and insert a linen thread, not unlike the kind used in saddle making. Over the following days, he would visit again and again, tightening the thread slightly, encouraging the wound to drain and slowly heal from the inside. It was grueling, painful, but for the first time, survivable. And John didn't just treat, he taught. He wrote down his methods in a manuscript titled De Arte Physicali et de Chirurgia, one of the earliest surgical manuals in England. Its pages were filled with diagrams, crude but clear. He included recipes for poultices, commentary on wound care, and biting remarks about other so-called experts. His tone could be sharp. He called academic physicians fat with pride and empty of practice. He even offered instructions for how to fake surgical skill if necessary. A curious mixture of realism and showmanship. This wasn't just a manual, it was a manifesto. And it set the stage for a new kind of medical practice, one based not on theory, but on observation, pain, and the grit of the surgeon's hand. In the world of 14th century medicine, status meant everything. Physicians were educated at universities, spoke Latin fluently, and often treated no one. They read Galen. They quoted Aristotle. But rarely, if ever, did they touch a wound. Surgeons, meanwhile, were considered manual laborers, tradesmen, craftspeople. They didn't theorize, they cut. And barber surgeons were lower still. They shaved heads, they pulled teeth, they drained boils and hacked off limbs when the need arose. To many, they were butchers with ambition. John of Ardern lived between these worlds. He styled himself more than a tradesman, but not quite a physician. He read the ancient texts, yes, but he also knew when to throw them aside. He didn't claim divine inspiration. He claimed experience. He had seen more bowels than most monks had Bibles, and he trusted his eyes more than any chart of stars. Still, John was careful. He understood the power of presentation. He wore robes. He copied the manners of the nobility. When treating knights, he carried himself like one. Because he knew, especially with the aristocracy, that how you looked was as important as what you knew. He even created elaborate casebooks to show potential clients, illustrated records of successful surgeries. drawings of fistulas before and after, letters of thanks from grateful and wealthy patients. He knew the value of a satisfied noble, but Ardern also had his critics. Academic physicians dismissed him as a pretender. Some accused him of reckless practice, of trying procedures too dangerous or experimental. Others whispered that he cared more about fame than healing. And yet, the results were difficult to ignore. In an age where most fistula patients died in agony, John survived. Some returned to battle, others to courtly life. A few even praised him in writing, rare testimonials in a world where memory often died with the patient. John didn't just save lives. He carved out a place for surgery in a world that mistrusted it. And perhaps most remarkably, he made it something to aspire to, not just endure. Though best known for treating fistulas, John of Ardern's surgical interests were broad, and his writings capture a world of wounds few dared even to describe. He detailed operations for abscesses in the throat and neck, sometimes drained with long needles passed through the skin. He wrote of trepanning, the careful cutting of holes in the skull to relieve pressure or infection. He even discussed hernias, tumors, and mysterious hard lumps in the abdomen, offering suggestions not just for treatment, but also for comfort in dying. These procedures were not gentle. There was no anesthesia, only cloth to bite, prayers whispered, and the hope that the surgeon's hands were steady that day. And yet, John remained undeterred. He believed knowledge should be passed on, not guarded behind secrecy or rank. In one famous section of his surgical text, he speaks directly to his readers, offering advice to young surgeons. "Beware of great swelling words," he writes, "for they heal not the sick." He cautions against pride. He warns against over-promising. And he repeatedly emphasizes one idea: see with thine own eyes. This might sound simple now, but it was radical then. In a world where many medical decisions were based on humours, astrology, or ancient doctrine, John called for observation, for experimentation, for the messy, often unpleasant truth of the human body. His writing, though laced with sarcasm, showed genuine care, not just for his patients, but for future surgeons. He included herbal remedies, lists of supplies, and step-by-step breakdowns of procedures. He even warned about mistakes, where things might go wrong and how to handle them. This was not a man hoarding knowledge for fame. This was a man trying to build a trade, to make healing something repeatable. Of course, Ardern also understood theatre. He knew that part of healing was belief. He recommended wearing fine robes during procedures. He advised making a show of cleanliness, even when true sterility was impossible. He talked about reputation, about how to appear confident, even when doubt loomed. He knew something most did not, that in pain, people don't just want skill, they want hope. And he gave it to them, by ink, by blade, and by fire. By the mid-14th century, John of Ardern had become something rare, a man without noble birth who commanded the respect of knights. He travelled widely, to London, to Newark, and to the battlefields of France. There, amid the 100 Years' War, he found his most challenging cases. Soldiers returned from skirmishes with crushed limbs, festering wounds, and deep lacerations earned in muddy fields. Physicians avoided them, but John stepped forward. He didn't offer comfort, he offered the knife. And for many, that was more than enough. On these battlefields, he honed his skills in trauma, resetting shattered bones, draining abscesses, cauterizing deep punctures. He sometimes had to amputate, though he preferred not to. He favored salvaging when possible, splinting rather than severing. But if the flesh turned black, the saw came out. These procedures were public, often performed in front of squires, fellow knights, or curious onlookers. John did not flinch under their gaze. If anything, he seemed to grow under it. He understood that reputation was a kind of armor, that every life saved added to his legend, that every failure had to be handled with grace or forgotten quickly. And when the war faded, he returned to England, but not to obscurity. By this time, he had begun to formalize his ideas. His surgical manuscript, begun years earlier, had expanded into a substantial text, complete with case histories and hand-drawn figures. He urged barbers and surgeons alike to study it, and in doing so, he laid the foundation for a generation of hands-on healers. Still, John didn't view his work as science. He didn't speak of medicine as a discipline, but as a craft, something learned by doing, perfected by failing, and sharpened by necessity. To him, healing was an act of bravery, not just for the patient, but for the surgeon. Each cut carried risk. Each thread of gut sewn through flesh could end in death or deliverance. And though he never received royal title or academic honor, he did receive something just as rare: enduring recognition. His manuscript would be copied and recopied, his methods preserved and adapted, his name spoken long after others faded. As John of Ardern aged, his influence only deepened. He wasn't just a practicing surgeon anymore. He had become a voice, a reference. Other barber surgeons carried copies of his work. Some even memorized passages. His methods were debated in guild halls, shared among apprentices, and whispered about in back rooms of hospitals and monasteries. By this time, surgery itself had begun to shift. The Black Death had swept through Europe, devastating populations and leaving cities desperate for any form of care. The shortage of physicians gave barber surgeons more visibility, and in some cases, more respect. Ardern's emphasis on practice over theory found new ground in this climate. People no longer wanted abstract theories of the four humours. They wanted wounds cleaned, bones set, fevers treated. And John had written the manual for exactly that. His language, often vivid and sometimes crude, made the work feel tangible. Where physicians had written coldly, John described the warmth of pus, the stench of infection, the way skin puckered before it tore. He described what wounds looked like, how they changed color, shape, and smell. He spoke of pain not as a concept, but as something that lived in the body. And while modern ears might flinch at the details, for those in his time, this was clarity. It was a guide to the reality of medicine, messy, uncertain, painful. His advice to fellow surgeons also extended beyond the body. He wrote of how to handle difficult patients, how to deal with nobles who made impossible demands, how to protect oneself from lawsuits or from blame if the patient died. He even gave advice on how to dress well, because appearance, he insisted, inspired trust. But Ardern's text was not only practical, it was also defensive. He frequently lashed out at physicians who looked down on surgeons. He argued that cutting flesh required more courage than quoting Galen. That real healing involved sweat, risk, and presence, not just parchment and ink. This friction between barber surgeons and physicians was deeply embedded in the period. The two groups occupied different legal and social spaces. Physicians often had degrees, surgeons had scars, but John saw the future, one in which skill and results might speak louder than lineage or language. He may not have known it, but his writing helped pave the way for surgery to become a recognized, respected branch of medicine. Not just the work of barbers with blades, but a discipline all its own. By the end of his career, John of Ardern had lived through war, plague, and medical revolution. And though he never belonged to the high circles of scholars or lords, his name had quietly threaded itself into the bones of English medicine. But his legacy wasn't built on patience alone. It was also preserved in vellum. The manuscript of De Arte Physicali et de Chirurgia survives in multiple copies, each hand-transcribed with margins filled by later readers. Some added notes, others corrected his Latin, but many left it as it was, bold, practical, and unapologetically hands-on. Its pages reveal a man who understood pain intimately, not just physical pain, the kind he cut into and stitched shut, but also professional pain. The insult of being overlooked, of being sneered at by the academically trained, of having no title except what your results could earn. And so Ardern wrote, not just to instruct, but to vindicate. He included stories of failure, not to discourage, but to educate. One patient died from a secondary infection. Another refused treatment until it was too late. In both cases, John reflected, what could have been done differently? What signs had he missed? In this, he was ahead of his time. He saw surgery not just as an art, but as a discipline that required self-questioning. He encouraged humility in his students, but not deference. Do not let the rich man's coat blind thee, he wrote. Pain is pain, whether felt by a king or by a beggar. He also paid attention to mental suffering. John often treated people shamed by their conditions. The knight with a hidden fistula, the merchant with a weeping sore. He never mocked them. Instead, he noted how illness could isolate, how wounds, even when bandaged, made people withdraw. This was rare insight for a time when the body was viewed as mechanical and the soul as separate. John somehow knew they were entangled. He was, in many ways, a practical man. But there was a strange compassion beneath the layers of sarcasm and steel, a sense that healing wasn't just about the knife, but about seeing someone fully, even when others turned away. As the twilight of his life approached, John of Ardern seemed to understand that his time and his approach belonged to a moment of transition. The old world of humours and charms was cracking. Something new was pushing through, slow, uneven, but real. He never joined the Royal College of Physicians. It didn't exist yet, nor did any modern hospital welcome surgeons under their roof. But in barber surgeon guilds, among the quiet ranks of men with stained aprons and worn hands, Ardern became something like a legend. In his later writings, he shifts slightly, from bitter to almost reflective. He writes about mistakes more freely, about the burden of being trusted with a stranger's body. He writes about loneliness, too, the cost of being feared and admired in equal measure. In one passage, nearly poetic, he says, "A man may cut and yet not heal, but no man may heal who dares not cut." It's a quiet confession that even after years of saving lives, of draining poison from noble flesh, there remained a shadow of doubt, a recognition that to intervene at all was to risk everything. He did not seek sainthood. He sought usefulness. In a world of rot and bleeding and cries behind closed doors, that was enough. John's death is not recorded with ceremony. There is no date carved in marble, No crypt beneath a church, just the manuscript, bound, copied, carried. And through that, he lived on. Through the hands of apprentice barbers who learned to cut carefully. Through the rising respect for surgeons whose craft grew sharper with each generation. And through the quiet gratitude of those who survived what should have killed them. He did not wear a crown. He wielded no power but that of a steady hand. But in a world teetering between superstition and science, John of Ardern was a bridge. And bridges, even when made of flesh and ink, are how we cross. If you were to walk into a medieval infirmary today, the kind attached to a priory or tucked behind castle walls, you might still find traces of John of Ardern. Not in name, perhaps, but in method. A certain curve of a blade, a caution in cutting, a willingness to look at what others would turn away from. And you'd notice something else too, the quiet authority of the barber surgeon, not a doctor, not a priest, but someone whose hands had become a kind of knowledge. Even centuries later, surgeons remained second to physicians until advances in anatomy and sanitation finally caught up. But John's work helped keep the line alive. He preserved the idea that healing wasn't just about status or theory, but about choosing to face the worst parts of being human. The pus, the pain, the helplessness, and refusing to look away. He did not romanticize this work. He described patients who cursed him, families who blamed him, nobles who refused to pay after treatment. He described wounds that reopened, infections that returned, limbs that rotted despite every intervention. And still, he persisted. His writings, copied by hand for over a century, became reference points not just for what to do, but how to think. They taught a generation that surgery wasn't savagery, that observation, repetition, and even failure were part of learning, that healing didn't require magic, just nerve, and enough knowledge not to lose your way when blood began to flow. In the end, John of Ardern's greatest gift wasn't a tool or a cure. It was a kind of courage, the courage to work in the shadows of knowledge, to believe that hands, trained, cautious, imperfect hands, could save lives in a world that offered so few second chances. And so, when we look back across the dim corridors of medieval medicine, through the smoke of burnt herbs and the clang of iron against wood, we find him there, standing beside a bed, thread in one hand, scalpel in the other, not hoping for a miracle, just hoping for a little more time. In the quiet corners of museums and archaeological vaults, behind glass or wrapped in careful linen, lie the remnants of a forgotten profession. Scissors with worn handles, rust-specked forceps, knives dulled by centuries of dirt and time. These are the tools of the barber surgeon. Not the polished steel of a modern operating theatre, but instruments built for urgency and survival. They surface from strange places, the base of ruined abbeys, the grave of a man buried with his tools still at his side, under floorboards in medieval homes, left behind like a forgotten trade. And each piece tells a story, not just of the body it once touched, but of the hands that held it, hands that cut, stitched, bled, and healed. One of the most common finds, blades of all shapes, short and hooked for cutting soft flesh, long and straight for opening abscesses, some sharpened on one edge, others on both, designed not for precision, but for adaptability. Many were made by local smiths. There was no standard design, no blueprint passed down. Each tool was personal, crafted by or for the barber who used it. a reflection of his habits, his methods, even his fears. Leather rolls have been found folded like traveling cases, inside scalpels, needles, clamps, sometimes small bone saws, everything a man might need to treat a battlefield wound, or a tooth gone bad. But these kits weren't always neat. Some were found bundled in cloth, stained dark and brittle. Others stored in wooden boxes with compartments for string, herbs, even coins. Coins, you might ask. Yes, even a preserved mouse, wrapped in linen, buried beside a blade. Whether for luck or for ritual, no one can say for sure. And then, of course, there were the bowls, made of pewter, brass, even painted ceramic, used for catching blood during leeching, for mixing poultices, or simply for rinsing a wound. One bowl, found beneath the floor of a London tavern, bore a faint inscription, "May God steady the hand." A prayer etched in metal, one that many surely whispered before each cut. Among the more fascinating discoveries in old barber surgeon kits are the tools designed for the smallest, most specific tasks. Instruments that hint at just how much these practitioners were expected to do. Tiny scoops carved from bone, some no longer than a thumb's width. Ear picks, used to extract wax or foreign objects from the ear canal. Not glamorous, not heroic, but essential. Some came paired with narrow rods, toothpicks of metal or ivory, often ornately carved. In a world where tooth decay could lead to fatal infection, hygiene was not vanity, it was survival. And then there were lancets, small blades, sharp as a whisper, used to open boils, drain blisters, or perform the most common and controversial of procedures, bloodletting. Hundreds of lancets have been uncovered, many folded into small cases lined with leather or cloth. Their handles were sometimes wrapped in twine for grip. Some were decorated, a curious flourish for a tool whose job was simple: open a vein. Bloodletting was a cornerstone of medieval medical thought. Barber surgeons were often called upon to balance the humours, especially when someone suffered from fever, delirium, or swelling. The idea was not to treat the disease directly, but to restore the internal balance by letting out blood. Not too much, not too little. A ritual, more than a cure. But it offered a kind of structure, a method, and for those who survived, maybe even relief. Certain kits even came with fleams, multi-bladed devices resembling small fans, each blade a different size for different veins. The largest were reserved for horses and livestock, but make no mistake, many were used on people too. In fact, some barber surgeons served dual roles in rural areas, treating both human patients and animals. A cow with a bloated stomach one day, a squire with a festering leg the next. Archaeologists have even found signs of cross-use, blades worn down from use on hide as well as skin. Evidence of a life where skill, not certification, defined who got to heal. And it's this improvisation that defines the toolkit of the barber surgeon. Each roll of tools was a blend of surgical necessity, folk tradition, and personal ritual. Every instrument told you what kind of healer its owner was, and what kind of world he lived in, where no cut was clean, and every cure came at a cost. Beyond the tools themselves, the places where these kits were found tell us almost as much as the instruments within. Some were uncovered in shallow graves, the barber surgeons buried with their kits, as if they might need them in the next life. Others were hidden, tucked beneath floorboards or inside walls, suggesting sudden departures or shame. In monasteries, toolkits were sometimes discovered near old infirmaries, left behind like ghosts of a once busy practice. One particularly well-preserved kit was unearthed beneath the ruins of a small chapel in northern France. Wrapped in oilcloth and bound with iron rings, it held over 24 instruments, bone saws, curved needles, forceps, even a hand drill, used perhaps for trepanning or draining fluid from joints. What startled researchers most wasn't the quantity, but the wear. Each tool bore marks of frequent use, nicks in the blades smoothing along the handles. This wasn't a ceremonial set, it was a working man's lifeline. And tucked beneath it all, a handwritten scrap of parchment, its ink faded but just legible, a list of herbs, betony, comfrey, plantain, and a note beside them. Boil thrice, let cool, for the wound that will not close. Even in the presence of metal, the barber surgeon turned often to plants. Herbs were their allies, poultices for swelling, salves for infection, tinctures to calm the stomach or the nerves. In some kits, dried leaves and seed packets were found. Others held little stoppered vials, the contents long evaporated, but the residue still dark and sticky. Cloth was just as important. Strips of linen for bandaging, often repurposed from worn-out shirts, wool pads for cushioning splints, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, blood-soaked rags folded and kept, perhaps intended for reuse. A reminder of how precious material was in a world where nothing came easy. Also common were cautery tools, long rods of iron with flat or pointed ends. These were heated in flame and pressed to wounds, used to seal vessels and purge corruption. The pain was unimaginable, but in a time before antibiotics, it was sometimes the only way to survive. Some rods were marked with notches, a sort of calibration maybe. Others bore initials stamped into the iron, not of the maker, but the man who used them. A quiet badge of identity, or perhaps of responsibility, because in a world where hands were the last defense against rot and ruin, those who wielded the blade lived in constant tension between necessity and regret. Among the strangest items recovered from barber surgeon kits are those that don't belong to medicine at all, at least not obviously. Coins, not just currency, but tokens, some pierced and strung on leather cords, some wrapped in parchment with inscriptions in Latin or Old French, protection against bad luck, payment for the ferryman. We can only guess. Others carried small carved stones, worn smooth from handling, thought to be touchstones, used for grinding herbs, or simply for calming nerves. And then there are the charms, miniature figurines, scraps of cloth bearing crosses, even bones, sometimes animal, sometimes human, carefully wrapped and placed in the deepest corners of the kit. To modern eyes, these seem superstitious, out of place, but for a barber surgeon, they may have been anchors. In a world of pain and unpredictability, these small objects were a way to grasp control, however fleeting. And perhaps even more telling, mirrors, polished bronze or silver discs, carried not for vanity, but for examination, held near the face to inspect swelling, tilted to see inside the mouth or eyes, a rare glimpse of the patient, and perhaps of the healer too. Some kits included small cloth books, made from layered linen, covered in notes, diagrams of wounds, lists of symptoms, measurements of bone lengths or finger spans, practical guides for men who often learned not from schools, but from pain itself. One kit, found buried near a medieval road outside York, contained a child-sized splint, carved with care and bound with padded wool. Its presence speaks softly but powerfully, that barber surgeons treated not only warriors and peasants, but children too. And while we rarely hear the stories of those who were too small to leave a record, their bones, and the tools shaped to fit them, tell us that they were seen, tended, and mourned. It's in these artifacts that the emotional weight of the profession becomes clear. The tools are not pristine. They are not ceremonial. They are scarred, scorched, and stained, much like the lives they touched. And in that wear, in every scratch and burn mark, you begin to see the human behind the healing, a man who carried the pain of others, one blade, one thread, one whisper at a time. Not every toolkit belonged to a battlefield barber or a town surgeon. Some came from quieter places, villages, parishes, outposts at the edge of forests. And those kits tell us something different, that surgery wasn't always an act of drama, but of daily routine. These smaller kits often contain fewer tools, perhaps a blade, a pair of tweezers, and a clamp. But they also held items that revealed the multi-role life of the local barber surgeon. Nail trimmers, callus scrapers, even lice combs, because in a town without a physician, the barber was everything. Groomer, healer, listener. A man who handled not just emergencies, but the slow maintenance of living. One kit found near a former mill site held a sharpened spoon, not for eating, but for scraping ulcers and infected skin. It was worn smooth on one side, its handle repaired with wrapped leather. A humble tool, but one that had seen years of service. There were no replacements, only repair, reuse, and endurance. Other finds suggest ingenuity, the way these practitioners adapted what they had. Horse tack refashioned into clamps, sewing needles bent and turned into suturing tools, even bits of bone carved into makeshift scalpel handles. Necessity drove invention, and in the absence of standards, creativity became a form of survival. Some barbers even carried their tools on their person, not in kits, but worn. Small pouches tied to belts, knives concealed in boot sheaths. One skeleton found near the edge of a medieval village still wore a rusted pair of shears in a leather case at his hip. His spine showed signs of arthritis. His fingers curled in death, still close to the tools he likely used for decades. In urban centers, more formal kits existed, sometimes passed from father to son. Others were donated to guilds or willed to apprentices. And every scratch, every burn, every stain told the same quiet truth. This was not glamorous work, but it was essential. And it left a mark, not just on the patient, but on the man who held the blade. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of the barber surgeon isn't the blade or the saw. It's the pole. That red and white spiral, now a decorative sign outside barbershops, began as something much more visceral. It was once a literal post, set outside a barber's door, with a bloodied bandage twisted around it, and a basin hanging at the top. The white represented clean linen, the red blood, the bowl at the top, for catching it. This wasn't just advertisement, it was announcement, a way for townsfolk to know, even from a distance, that here was a man who could lance, bleed, and mend. Some of these poles have been recovered, not full-sized, but small tabletop versions used inside the shop. They would stand beside the bowl and blade, a constant reminder of the work at hand. In urban barber-surgeon guilds, these poles became badges of office, formalized into the design we recognize today. But their roots were stained in blood and cloth, soaked in the ritual of daily procedures. In some preserved barber surgeon spaces, shops frozen in time beneath layers of later construction, archaeologists have found the layout almost untouched. A central chair, a basin stand, hooks on the wall for aprons, blades, and scissors, and often a small shelf with bottles, marked with symbols rather than words. One might hold vinegar, another oil, a third, perhaps something stronger. Alcohol not just for the patient, but for the practitioner too. These spaces were compact, efficient, and utterly unlike modern clinics. They were messy, full of scent and sound. The hiss of boiling water, the snap of thread pulled taut, the occasional cry, muffled by cloth or swallowed in silence. And yet, in these rooms, something profound happened. Wounds were treated. Lives were extended. Pain was acknowledged, not hidden or ignored, but met face to face. The pole outside signaled not perfection, but presence. A promise that someone was inside, ready, however imperfectly, to try. Of all the places where barber surgeon kits have been uncovered, few are as evocative as graves. These aren't grand tombs or vaulted crypts. They're shallow, humble, often unmarked, the resting places of working men. In several such graves, tools were found nestled beside the bones, not ceremonially arranged, but tucked close to the hip or shoulder, as if placed by someone who understood. This was more than a trade. It was identity. In one burial near Cologne, a man was interred with a set of instruments so heavily used, their blades were more notch than edge. A small bundle of cloth was folded near his feet. Inside, what remained of a compress, stained and stiff with age. Next to it, a pewter charm, a tiny crucifix, worn nearly smooth. Other graves reveal something stranger. Barbers buried without their hands. A grim practice, but not unheard of. In some places, if a healer was accused of negligence or failed someone powerful, they were posthumously punished. Their hands, symbols of skill and responsibility, removed in judgment. And yet, even these burials hold a kind of tragic honor, because the tools remain. The evidence that these men, however flawed, stood between life and death when few others dared. In one rural cemetery in England, archaeologists found a man buried with a single knife and a comb. Simple items. But the comb was carved with unusual care. Its handle inlaid with pewter, its teeth worn smooth from years of use. More than a grooming tool, it was an emblem. Proof that even among the poor, barber surgeons were more than their role. They were part of the community, tending not just wounds, but dignity, preparing bodies for burial, offering comfort in the form of clean hair, trimmed nails, or a stitched gash. For many, the barber was the last human touch before death, and sometimes the first after birth. Their tools didn't just cut, they cleansed, they comforted, they bore witness. And when those same tools were laid down forever, they carried with them the story of a life not lived in glory, but in quiet, relentless service. Not all barber surgeon kits were found underground. Some were preserved by accident, forgotten in attics, sealed behind walls, or left behind when buildings were repurposed. And when these kits surface, they often arrive like time capsules, their contents speaking softly of a vanished world. In the attic of a crumbling manor house in northern France, a small leather chest was discovered behind a false panel. Inside, neatly wrapped in linen, lay a complete barber surgeon's set. 2 folding razors, a bone-handled scalpel, a tiny ear scoop, and a collection of stoppered glass vials, some still holding faint traces of dried herbal residue. There was also a folded piece of parchment, a note written in a neat, slanted hand. Remember to pray before the blade, and listen more than you speak. The writing didn't name its author, but it didn't need to. It spoke of a man who understood that healing wasn't just technical, it was relational. That part of the work involved bearing witness to suffering without judgment. Other kits found in urban centers, especially near ports or trade roads, include tools tailored for travelers. Small portable sets. Blades and hooks arranged in foldable wallets, designed to be slung from a belt or carried in a pouch. Some even included simple weighing scales, likely used to measure herbs or dried roots. One such set, found near a medieval wharf, included a thin curved rod with a hook on one end. Its use puzzled researchers, until comparisons revealed it was likely used for fishing out lodged objects from the throat. Not a glamorous job, but life-saving if someone had choked on bone or bread. These discoveries remind us that the role of the barber surgeon was elastic. He didn't just deal in dramatic surgery. He pulled splinters from children's feet. He set broken fingers. He watched over infections. He applied poultices to aching joints and checked teeth for rot. He was, in many ways, the only healthcare provider some communities had, and so his tools had to reflect that. Each one a compromise between function and limitation. They were not elegant, but they were used. And in their wear, their rust, their stubborn survival, they still whisper of the hands that wielded them, and the people whose lives were changed by their edge. If you held one of these toolkits in your hand today, if you could feel the weight of the blades, the worn grip of the scissors, the faint curve of the forceps, you'd likely notice how human it all feels. Not cold, clinical metal, but something hand-forged, practical, made not for machines, but for people. What you wouldn't see are the stories. The boy who screamed into his father's cloak while a boil was lanced. The woman whose dislocated shoulder was reset with one clean jerk. The soldier who survived his wound, but not the fever that followed. All those lives moved through a room, a chair, a toolkit, and always behind the tools was a person, a barber surgeon, untrained by today's standards, often mistrusted, sometimes revered. He worked with what he had: a cracked basin, a bent sikali, a prayer half whispered while the patient clenched a strap of leather in their teeth. He stood between chaos and whatever came after. And the tools, those humble instruments recovered from graves, ruins, and forgotten corners, they remain as quiet witnesses, not of heroism, not of mastery, but of effort, of imperfect hands doing the work no one else dared to do. They remind us that history isn't always written in declarations or bloodlines. Sometimes it's etched in rust, in the edge of a knife dulled by years of use, in the soft imprint left in a leather roll folded too many times. And though those tools no longer cut, they still speak. In silence, in steel, in stories carved deep into the wood of history. The castle is quiet in the early morning. Not silent. There are fires being stoked, boots on stone floors, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen. But quiet enough that your footsteps echo, because you walk not among the wounded and the poor today, but among the polished corridors of the elite. You are a barber surgeon still, but your hands, today, do not grip sores or scrape boils. They hold a gilded razor, a silver comb. You move not through mud, but marble. You serve a king. Each morning begins in the same way, a knock on the chamber door, a whisper from the steward. The king is ready. Inside the royal bedchamber smells of wool and rosewater. The air is heavy with stillness, the kind that can only be broken by permission. You bow always, not too low, not like a servant, but never like a peer. The king sits, robe draped across his shoulders, the crown absent but always implied. He gestures for you to begin. You approach with tools already warmed. Hot water for the shave, a lather brush made from badger hair, a razor honed to perfection, its handle carved with ivory. You do not speak unless addressed. You watch for every twitch of his brow. One nick, one slip of the hand, and the favor you've spent years earning could vanish in a heartbeat. Because here, in this room, pain is political. Comfort is a matter of control, and your job is to walk the razor's edge. Literally, yes, but also socially. As you shave, you listen. To the king's mutterings, to the gossip of the court that drips from his lips like wine, to what he fears, what he envies. You nod, never judge, never repeat, because more than the blade, it's your silence that keeps you in favor. And once the shaving is done, perhaps a quick bleed, if the king's astrologer has warned of an imbalance. Perhaps the removal of a hangnail that's become inflamed. Perhaps. Just a haircut. It doesn't matter. What matters is precision. Clean hands, calm breath, and the quiet understanding that every movement is being watched by stewards, by guards, by the king himself. You may wear silk now. You may carry your blades in a velvet pouch, but you are still a barber surgeon. Only now. Your mistakes aren't paid for in coin. They're paid for in whispers, disgrace, or disappearance. Once the king is seen to, your day doesn't end. In fact, it begins in earnest. Because in court, the barber is not merely a servant of grooming. He is a custodian of quiet crises. A duke's face is flushed from drink. He asks if you might take a little from the arm. You bring your fleam and basin. He does not wince. He's grateful. Tomorrow, he'll speak your name to others. A young page arrives with a boil hidden beneath his collar. His pride won't let him tell anyone else. But he trusts your hands because they've held sharper truths. Later, a noblewoman's handmaid calls you discreetly. There's a cut, an infection. She will not go to the royal physician. Too public, too slow. She comes to you in secret. In court, every illness is a liability. Every weakness must be hidden. And that's where you come in. Your tools are the same as they've always been. But their context has changed. Your scissors are polished. Your cloths, monogrammed. Your basin no longer pewter, but silver. Your cautery irons, rarely used now, hang behind silk screens, where no noble eye need see them. But you keep them oiled, just the same. Because privilege does not stop infection. And even kings rot if left too long untended. You walk halls lined with gold, but your thoughts remain grounded. You still remember the days of mud and cracked floorboards. You remember how a scream echoed in a wooden shop. How blood once dried on your apron because you couldn't afford a second one. Now, your apron is linen, starched and pressed. But beneath it, you carry a second cloth. Darker, older, for the wounds no one else is meant to see. Court life brings its own kind of pain, its own kind of filth, the unseen, the unspoken. A prince with a festering tooth too proud to admit he cannot sleep. A queen's maid whispering of swelling and fever, begging you not to write her name. They come in secret, they leave in silence, and they thank you not with coin, but with safety. In court, the value of a barber surgeon isn't measured in gold. It's measured in how well you keep a secret, and how few people know you are ever there. Evenings at court are glittering affairs, feasts, dancing, music echoing through vast stone halls. But you rarely join. You wait nearby, behind tapestries, or just beyond a servant's corridor, because illness doesn't wait for sunrise, and neither do accidents. A falconer cut his palm on a talon hook. You stitched it under torchlight. A nobleman collapsed from heat and wine. You applied leeches behind a curtained alcove. Once, a foreign envoy gashed his lip in a duel, and you were summoned not to heal, but to ensure there would be no scar. Politics, after all, are fought on faces as well as fields. You work quietly, efficiently. There is no applause, no announcement. Sometimes the courtiers pass you in the hall and look through you, as if the role you play, so intimate, so vital, is invisible by design. And in truth, it is. Because at court, image is everything. You are the one who maintains that illusion. You shave the jowls of aging dukes to make them seem younger. You dress wounds so finely they can wear silk again by morning. You apply rose oil to hide the scent of infected flesh. You keep death at bay just long enough for the next banquet. And you do it all while never forgetting the weight of every mistake. Because the higher the client, the sharper the consequence. There was a barber once, too bold, too rough, who nicked the king's ear. He was dismissed. A year later, rumors whispered he'd gone missing. Another tried to remove a wart from a countess. She fainted. The blemish returned. She never called him again. You learn fast that court barbering isn't about perfection. It's about invisibility, control, restraint, and above all, precision. You walk a path between servant and confidant, between blood and perfume, between danger and dignity. And while others may sleep peacefully in feathered beds, you lie awake, replaying the way the knife slid, the way a noble's face twitched at your touch, because your hands hold more than razors. They hold consequences. At the end of the night, long after the torches have been dimmed and the laughter in the great hall has faded, you return to your own chamber, smaller, quieter, tucked away near the servants' quarters. You remove your apron, not stained today, but starch stiff. You unroll your tools one by one. Check each blade, wipe each handle. The same ritual you've performed 1,000 times. There's no audience, no applause, just the soft crackle of a candle and the creak of old floorboards beneath your boots. Sometimes you catch your own reflection in a bowl or mirror, a face lined not by age, but by caution. A man who listens more than he speaks, who has held the faces of kings, the wrists of generals, and who has never, not once, asked for recognition. You are known, but never named. Trusted, but never praised. Your hands have more power than your title ever will. And still, you do the work. Because even in velvet halls, the body breaks. Even in golden chambers, people bleed. And someone must be there to catch the silence that follows. You are not a physician. You are not a knight. You are not written into the royal histories. But you kept the king from fever. You saved the queen's maid from infection. You cut quietly, stitched carefully, and vanished before the sun rose. You are the barber, the surgeon, the shadow in silk. And though no statue bears your name, every life you tended carried you forward. A quiet legacy, a steady hand, a blade that knew both mercy and necessity. And now the tools are folded away. The last basin is emptied. The shop is dark. The court is silent. Tonight, you've walked through lives once lived in quiet service. Through cold stone rooms, firelit chambers, and battlefields echoing with cries. You've held razors sharpened not for beauty, but for survival. You followed the path of men who cut not for glory, but because someone had to. Barber surgeons were never saints. They weren't surgeons in the modern sense, or barbers in the simple one. They were something in between. A bridge between the mystical and the medical, the sacred and the bloody. They held hands that trembled and hands that struck, and with blades that dulled too fast, they stitched together a world still learning how to heal. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their scars remain. On bones unearthed, on tools rusted and buried, on the stories whispered from mouth to mouth until finally someone listened. So as you drift now, as the fire fades and the hush deepens, know this: you've just spent an hour in the company of the quietest heroes of history. Not warriors, not kings, but men in aprons, men with razors, men who held life and death in their hands and never stopped showing up.